Good afternoon, and welcome to today's program commemorating the 86th anniversary of Kristallnacht. My name is Adina Lungan. I am a social worker at Jewish Child and Family Service, where I work in our agency's Support Services to Holocaust Survivors program. JCFS is proud to be partnering with the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada and with the Ronald S. Roadburg Foundation to bring you today's guest speaker,
Bernard Pinsky. We are also grateful for the support of the Jewish Federation of Winnipeg. We acknowledge that we are gathered here today on the national homeland of the Red River Métis and the original treaty lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. The term harms of the past, used in the land acknowledgement text, is a term which also resonates with Jews all over the world post-Kristallnacht and post-Holocaust. Harms of the past become harms of the present as we witness and experience an alarming surge of anti-Semitism worldwide, especially since October 7th. We have a duty to memorialize events such as Kristallnacht. In so doing, we honor those killed in the Holocaust and learn from that tragic, hate-filled period in history. Sadly, many Canadians have very little knowledge of the Holocaust and have never even heard of Kristallnacht. A joint study done in Canada in 2019 by the Azrieli Foundation and the Claims Conference revealed that an astonishing 52% of millennials, those currently between the ages of 28 and 43, could not name even one concentration camp or ghetto. Nearly 1/4 of millennials have not heard of or are not sure if they have heard of the Holocaust. The reality of these grim statistics compels us to remember individual stories of survivors, such as the one we are going to hear today, and to confront attempts to distort history. The story at the heart of today's program is told in the book, Ordinary, Extraordinary, My Father's Life, written by Bernard Pinsky. The book recounts the harrowing story of Bernard's father, Rubin Pinsky, during the Holocaust. Belle Jarniewski, Executive Director of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, will be joining Bernard in what I am sure will be an insightful discussion of this meaningful book. So let me tell you about our guest speaker and author. Bernard Pinsky was born and raised in Winnipeg and attended the University of Manitoba, where he graduated with a BA and an LLB. After spending a year in Israel, he moved to Vancouver in 1979, where he started a legal career that spanned over 40 years, including being qualified to practice law in California. He and his wife, Daniela Givon, raised a family with 2 boys, and he was very active in many Canadian Jewish organizations on a local and national level, including President of the Vancouver Jewish Federation, Treasurer of UIA Federations Canada, and was on the national boards of Canadian Jewish Congress and CJA. In 2022, Bernard retired from law to become a co-founder and the full-time board chair of the Ronald S. Roadburg Foundation, a private charitable foundation engaging in philanthropic initiatives in both the Jewish and broader communities worldwide. Please join me in welcoming Bernard Pinsky and Belle Jarniewski. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today, we mark 86 years since Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. Kristallnacht was a test for civil society, and one that it failed. Between November 9th and 10th, 1938, a wave of violent anti-Jewish pogroms took place throughout Germany and Austria, and in areas of the Czechoslovakian Sudetenland that had recently been occupied by German troops. During those 24 hours, more than 1,000 synagogues were set on fire and destroyed. Almost 100 people were murdered, and Jewish properties and businesses were vandalized and looted. In the aftermath, thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The Jewish community was fined exorbitant amounts for the cleanup, and it was the passivity of non-Jewish German civilian population in response to the events of Kristallnacht that the Nazis interpreted as a signal that the public was prepared to accept even more radical measures against the Jewish population. In the last year, we have sadly been seeing echoes of 1938. In the past year, far too many have been silent in the face of the October 7th massacre and its aftermath, and also have ignored the huge increase in anti-Semitism here and around the world. And of course, just the other day, the attacks on Jews in Amsterdam were frighteningly reminiscent of 1930s. As the Nazis blamed the Jews back then for the violence that erupted, so Jews have once again been blamed for the disaster that befell them. We saw the attempt to twist and distort what happened on October 7th, and just how quickly and easily people were willing to believe outright lies. Today, more than ever since the Shoah, we understand the importance of education, and that Kristallnacht is a stark reminder of the violence that can so easily occur when anti-Semitism is left unchallenged. So welcome, Bernard, and thank you for being here on this important date. The title of your book is perfect. It's the remarkable story of your father during the Holocaust. It's miraculous and it's spellbinding. His life in Canada after the Holocaust reminded me of the inspiring accomplishments of so many of our survivors who had experienced so much loss and trauma, and yet were able to go on to provide for their families and leading a fulfilling life. So before I go any further, Bernard, you're originally from Winnipeg and have been deeply involved with the Vancouver Jewish community on many levels. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you, Belle. By the way, I like to swallow the microphone. I'm a hard of hearing, and I like to have people hear me. So first of all, I'm just so pumped and excited to be here presenting this book in Winnipeg. This is a book about Winnipeggers. I've been waiting to do this for a long time, and my father came here, started his life here. My mother was born in Winnipeg. My grandparents came to Winnipeg in the 1920s. I have lots of relatives here. Thank you very much for showing up to make me feel better. And friends from the past who showed up and reminded me who they were, who I haven't seen in 50 years. But it's a great, great feeling, and I'm very, very excited to do this. So thank you for having me. So I part of the ketubah that I signed, which is a marriage certificate between a man and a woman in the Jewish tradition, I promised to try to live in Israel with my wife, Daniela Givon, who I married in 1975. It's coming up 50 years pretty soon, oh my God. And we went to Israel, and at the end of the year, it was a different place. 1978 was 1979. It was a different time in Israel. It was a different place. And I was pretty ambitious young guy. And I was on the Dean's Honor List of the Robson Hall Law School, and I got there, and I don't know much Hebrew, and I don't know the laws. And I worked really hard, and I passed exams to have them recognize my law degree, and I worked there for a year. And it just, after a year, I said, I can't do this. I got no connections. I'm not going to make any money. And Daniela said, okay, but we got to go. And my parents by then were living in Vancouver, and my sister was living in Vancouver. She said, Winnipeg's too cold for me in the winter. Let's go to Vancouver. So I said, sure, we did that, and it worked out okay. And in 1979, I started becoming an articling student again in Vancouver. And, I was starting to live my life and meeting people. And 1981, Israel had enough with the terrorists who were attacking from Lebanon on a regular, much like Hezbollah now, but they were attacking on a regular basis. And Israel went into Lebanon to try to clean it up and get some more friendly people living close to the border. And it actually became the good fence at one time. And the newspapers and the media was kind of like it is now. It was really coming against Israel, always taking the side of Lebanon and how Israel had attacked Lebanon and wasn't for no reason, et cetera. And whatever your politics were, it was very uncomfortable for the Jewish community, not nearly as uncomfortable as it is now, but it was uncomfortable. And so the community in 1981 organized a community meeting, the elders and the leaders of the community, and they said, what are we going to do? Is there something we should be doing? And one after another, the elders of the community and the leaders were saying, you know what? We're a very small community, the Jewish community. Let's not make a fuss. Let's keep our heads down, be quiet, don't say anything, don't write to the newspapers. And I was 24, 25 at the time, and I stood up, just having come to Israel, from Israel, with a huge dose of chutzpah. I stood up and said, listen, hey, wait a second, we can't let this go. I mean, they're getting it's not just whether you agree with them or not, it's they're getting the facts wrong. They're lying about the situation. We got to write and at least correct them as to what they're doing, and that didn't go anywhere. But at the end of that meeting, the executive director of Canadian Jewish Congress came up to me and says, I need you. We're going to start a group that's going to start writing to the Vancouver Sun and the CBC, and whenever they make a mistake that's just not right factually, we're going to tell them that they're wrong. And we did, and that's what we did. And so from 1981, I got involved deeply and never looked back. I've never taken a break from community involvement, and I always say I get at least as much out as I put in. So it's been very gratifying for me.
But this book you started writing quite some time ago, and then you set it aside for a decade. So what happened? What took so long?
Oy, that's a story. But I'm gonna tell it to you because you're all sitting here, you're a captive audience. So my dad was a businessman. He started as a teacher. He was a businessman here, and he wasn't that successful a businessman. He did all kinds of different things. And, I always felt that he had been underappreciated, I guess, comparatively to the other side of my family, which was the Moser side of the family. My cousin Kathy Moser, Itzko, is here, and her husband. So as the Mosers, they had been born here, or they were from a very young age. They spoke English perfectly. They knew the culture. They went to university. Some of them became professors and lawyers and academics, and it was kind of not. I would say I felt that he was underappreciated for what he had done. He came in his mid-20s, not knowing a word of English, not knowing a word of French, having no idea of the culture of Canada whatsoever. And he made a living, and he made a life for us, and we didn't feel any different than anyone else. We felt normal. And so I decided for his 72nd birthday in 1996 to write the story of his life, because I had been so charmed by him coming to my bedroom when I was a kid, and my brother was either awake or asleep because he's 4 years younger than me. And my dad would come from work, and he was hungry, and he hadn't had dinner yet. It was probably 8:30-ish, and he would sit on our beds and tell us stories, really not scary stories about the Holocaust, but stories of Europe and we might get into one or two of those stories later. And they were emblazoned in my brain, so I wanted to remind him where he came from and give him the honor of having a manuscript written about him. So I gave it to him on his birthday, December 5th, 1996. And he had TIAs, there's sort of mini strokes by then, and I'm not sure if he ever really read the book, but he was very happy to receive it. And I also sent it to other relatives, to my relatives here, to my relatives in other places. And one of the relatives that I sent it to was Melvin Fenson, who married into our family. Melvin Fenson was a New Yorker who came to Winnipeg and married my mother's cousin, Ruth Fenson. And he was actually the publisher of the Jewish Post for many years. And then he decided to go back to law school and took law, and he became a lawyer, and he became a partner of Walsh McKay, which was a very well-known firm here. But in 1976, he made Aliyah. And Aliyah means he moved to Israel with his family, and he actually became a lawyer in Israel. So when I sent him this, he wrote me and said, there's some pretty good stuff here about the Holocaust. And, there's some good details and about what happened and how your father lived. I'd like to submit it to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, which is the keeper of all the archives. And he said, if you'll permit me, I'll do that. And I said, sure, go ahead and put it in. I don't mind. And he did. And in early, believe it or not, I didn't think that it would happen, but in fact, I've got a copy of the letter here from Yad Vashem, dated June 19th, 1997. It says, "Dear Mr. Pinsky, through Mr. Melvin Fenson, advocate, we received the biography of your father. Your efforts, having written this publication, are very much appreciated, as this book comprises a valuable addition to our collection. There's no doubt in my mind that your work will serve the numerous scholars and students who frequent our library. Thank you very much," etc., etc. And I thought, wow, that's pretty nice. I'm really excited about that, but I didn't really have much faith or hope that somebody's actually going to read it. I mean, there's so much material at Yad Vashem. Why would this one come up? And nothing did happen for 10 years. 10 years later, I got a letter, handwritten in English, and it's from, my address, Zhana Nagovoskaya. She's in a town called Jatlovo of Belarus. And I'm thinking, why am I getting this letter? And I'll read it to you, and then I'll tell you what the confusion was. In March 2008, I have visited Yad Vashem. There I have found a book, Ordinary Extraordinary, My Father's Life, the story of Rubin, Harry, and Chasya Pinsky, which was written by yourself. There are much interesting materials in your book, which is required for our museum and my own book, Holocaust at Jatlovo region. I ask for your permission to translate material of book from English to Russia and use it and understand and help me in future. This is out of the blue. What's Jatlovo? No idea. Belarus. My father came from Jetl, Poland. So I do a little research, and we found that, of course, when the Russians, all the Jews were gone, the Russians had moved in. Not only did Belarus take over, and it became Belarus instead of Poland, but also they changed the name to a Russian name, Jatlovo. So Jatlovo, Belarus was, tell them I'm not home. Jatlovo was Jetl, Poland, which my father came from. So I got very excited, and at the bottom she said my home phone number, and she gives about 15 numbers here because it's international. So what did I do? I phoned her, of course. I phoned her. Hello, is this Zhana Nagovoskaya? It's Bernard Pinsky. I'm the guy you wrote to, and I'm so excited that you do this. I really want to talk to you. There's so much to talk about. No Engleski. No Engleski. She didn't speak a word. Somebody wrote this for her. Didn't speak a word of English. I don't speak a word of Russian, not Polish, no nothing. A couple of words of Yiddish maybe. Anyway, Hebrew I'm pretty good at. So we couldn't communicate there, but I had her address. So through writing back and forth, I know this is a long story, but it is a point to it. Through writing back and forth, we communicated, and I told my brother and my sister about it, and my brother Max got really excited, and he decided that he wanted to take a roots trip with his daughter to the place where our father had been born and raised. And he went in February, why February, I don't know, of 2009 to visit this town. And he knew he had written to her, and they had corresponded, and they were expecting him. And he gets to this town of now about 9,000 or 10,000 people, and there's no Jews there left at all. He gets there, and he goes to this Jana, and he has an interpreter, and she is a high school teacher. She's someone who learned about the fact that there had been Jews there years ago by chance, and then she went to Yad Vashem, and she decided that she was going to write about it. So he gets there in February of 2009, and the whole high school has closed down for a special assembly of everyone to tell the Canadian honored guests about the town, what's happened since the Second World War. They want to hear about what happened to his family. I wouldn't have believed it myself, but there's a video of them being on the stage and being asked all kinds of questions, and there's big slideshows and people talking in Russian and in English, but every English person who had ever taken an English class in the whole town had to have his say or her say. It was very exciting. And why were they treating him like such royalty? He's the brother of the famous author who wrote about Jatlovo, Belarus. And anyway, it took him a couple of years to convince me that I should go. And I did in 2012 with my wife Daniela and my cousin Lawrence and his wife Jennifer and my brother Max and his son. The six of us went, and in June of 2012 we went, and I think we're gonna get to that later about what I saw, but anyway, at the end of that trip, it was so emotional, it was so uplifting and yet crushing at the same time, that Daniela, in her wisdom, said, look, you got to take that book and finish it, because my father was still alive when I wrote it, and he passed a few years later. And now I had this incredible experience of going to Belarus and to his town. You got to make it into a book, and you have to publish it. And I said, you know what? I'm working hard as a lawyer. I've got a busy practice, and I've got lots of volunteer work. When I retire, I'll write it up. Well, the years passed from 2012, and in 2021, this foundation, this assets fell into my lap, and I created a foundation with it, and I quit law. I retired from law, but I started full-time at the Roadburg Foundation, and it was actually at least as much, for the first year, it was much more work than my legal practice, and so Daniela said, you know what? That's enough. You're never going to retire. You're never going to have time that you're not looking at the computer all day. You got to write it now. So I did. I finished it last year, and we had our Vancouver launch on International Holocaust Remembrance Day at the end of January this year.
So the book begins in pre-war Jettel. What can you tell us about your father's family, about the town?
So my father was one of 4 children. He had an older sister, Chassia, who ended up living in Winnipeg for a long time as well, and an older brother, slightly older brother, Herschel, who's Lawrence Pinsky and Mati Pinsky's father, and he ended up living in Winnipeg as well. And my father, and they had a younger sister who perished in the Holocaust at age 11. And, Jettel, Jatlovo was actually quite a primitive town. I think my father said that even in the late 30s, they only had one car in the whole city, in the whole town. About 6,000 people lived there. 2/3 of them were Jewish. People, the Jews and the non-Jews got along well. My grandfather was a baker, but he also was a trader of grains from the farmers, so he knew some farmers outside of town. He did anything he drayed, he got into whatever he could do in order to make a living. They were very religious. My father was going to be a rabbi. So he went to a yeshiva in another city called Molchech and was studying there to be a rabbi. He had no life skills at all. He was going to be a rabbi. And then the war broke out, and he was... I guess 17 or 16, and that was the end of him studying. But basically, it was a quiet small town. The biggest streets were called this Strasse and that Strasse, which means what's the next biggest town? Baranovich and Slonium and towns like that. But this was a small town comparatively, and in the crossroads of nowhere.
So we're in World War II, the beginning. First, the Russians come to Jettel, and then the Nazis. And like many other places, the Jews are forced into a ghetto. So I'm going to ask you what happened from there, but I think, in fact, this is where you'd like to read an excerpt from your book that really explains exactly what did happen.
Right. I think this is the best way to explain what happened is kind of in my book, and I can't top the author on this explanation. So this is an excerpt from chapter 3, which you'll all get to read after. On June 30th, 1941, the Germans captured the town. All the Soviet soldiers were either captured, killed, or had fled. When the German troops arrived, despite the fact that the town had been predominantly Jewish, there were no Jews to be seen. The Germans had experience with this phenomenon. The non-Jews had not hidden, and the Germans required of these people, sometimes with and sometimes without force, to locate their Jewish neighbors. The local non-Jews knew the town as well as the Jews, knew all the hiding places, and very quickly, all the Jews of the town were located. They were told to go home and not leave. Orders would be forthcoming. Being found through the betrayal of a neighbor, the Pinskys waited at home as they were told. What else was there to do? Baruch Lipa, that's my grandfather, being quite a religious man, started to pray. So did Rubin. Rubin's sisters and his mother quietly cried to themselves. What would become of them? It was known that Germans hated Jews, that things would get bad. But how bad could they truly get? As long as the family was together, God would not let anything so terrible happen to them. They were God-fearing people. I've often wondered to myself if they were truly comforted by these thoughts. In a situation beyond your control, you have to say things to yourself and those around you that will make you feel better, calm you down. Do we really believe them, or do we know in our hearts that the worst will happen? We know that we try to comfort others by looking at the bright side. It works, I suppose. But in this case, had Jews not comforted each other and realized the truth, perhaps they would have taken the desperate measures that were needed to save themselves. Within 3 days of the capture of Zettel, the Nazis began to put up their decrees in public places. Jews could leave their homes, but there was a curfew of 6 p.m. Any Jews caught outside of their homes after the curfew would be shot. Jews were not allowed to walk in the public sidewalks. From now on, they must walk in the street beside the horses. The gold, furs, jewelry, and other valuables of the Jews was badly needed for the war effort. So were any weapons that the Jews owned, including knives. Jews must deliver any valuables and weapons to the German authorities that would issue a full receipt. Any Jews found with any weapons of any kind or valuables that were needed for the war effort by the end of 3 days would be shot. The Jews scrambled to obey. Long lines of Jews holding all their valuable possessions in their arms was the norm for several days outside of the German headquarters, at least until 6 p.m. The Germans allowed no exceptions to the curfew. A Jew who stood in line for hours to give away his valuables to the Germans had to return home at 6 p.m. If 6 p.m. were approaching and line up the next day, violators would be and were shot. Nazi rules were fixed and not to be bent. The Nazis made sure that they would be taken totally seriously when they shot the first Jew the first day for some very minor offense. The others knew to obey from then on. Jews had few, if any, weapons, no guns to speak of. They had never learned to use guns. They were not a people who hunted because it was a sin to kill wastefully, and they would not eat the meat of the animals that they hunted if the animal had not been ritually slaughtered. Kitchen knives and other sharp instruments were all turned in. Once the valuables and weapons of the Jews were all collected, other decrees started being posted with daily regularity. Jews must deliver any bicycles that they owned for use in the war effort. Jews must collect any food stores that they had and deliver it to German headquarters to assist in the war effort. Jews must deposit any warm clothes that they have to German headquarters to assist in the war effort. All violators would be shot, and on and on and on. Every day, a new decree. By July 15th, 1941, Jews had very few possessions left. Everything had been turned over to the German authorities, who had issued receipts for everything they received. The Nazis kept immaculate records of everything.
Thank you. And so soon after this, Rubin and Chassia flee into the forest and they become partisans. What can you tell us a little bit about this and the others they fought with? But also, I want you to tell us this incredible story of the wolf and the rabbit.
So soon after our grandparents and our aunt was killed, my father and the other people he was with, and basically he was with a group of people who had been able to work outside of Jettel for the war effort for the Nazis. So that's the way to stay alive, was to work, physical work. And Rubin's brother Harry was already out of the house. He was in the Russian army. And so his sister Chassia, his younger sister Rachel, and his parents lived with him. And he would go out for the day and come back and had a bit of food that he could share, but there was very little that they could do. But on April 30th, 1942, a whole huge group, another group, one after the other, was sort of marched out of the town and slaughtered and just basically lined up against big holes and killed. And when my father came back from work that day, his family wasn't there anymore. His sister was alive with him because she was also working. She was about 19 or 20, and he was about 16 or 17. And they realized that they have to escape. And you can read the book about as to how they escaped, but they escaped with a group of young people. Actually, it was people, about a dozen people between the ages of 8 and 20. I think my Aunt Chassia was the oldest, and the youngest was a cousin who was only 8 years old. So they went into the forest. And these are people who were not farmers. They were townsfolk, and they really didn't know how to live in the forest, but they had to learn. And very quickly they started to learn, although they thought they would starve. And my father went to work for a Nazi camp where he was told by some other some other Jew that he met in the forest, that it was that you could live there. You could, as long as you could work, you could get enough to eat. And so, sort of biding his time, he spent a few weeks there, but after that he saw he was going to be worked to death and left it. So they went to the forest and tried to figure out what to do. And there were partisan groups in the forest, but the partisans, there were very few Jewish partisans. Often the Jews were part of a Russian group, and those groups would not accept people to join the partisans unless you had a weapon, and they had no weapons. I mean, there, as you probably all know, there was a Bielski group, but they weren't in that part of Poland. So this part had Russian-led partisan groups, and they wouldn't let them come with them because they didn't have it. And it took my father with his group over 6 months to eventually get a weapon. He finally found someone where he could get a weapon, and he did, and then at that point they could join the partisans. But during the 6 months, they did what they had to do to survive. I mean, they learned what to eat in the forest, the berries, what roots you could eat. It was kind of lucky that he went into the forest in May, because he had all summer in order to learn what trees and roots and things like that, because winters, it's all snow-covered. It's much like Winnipeg, probably ended up here because of that. It reminded him of home. It's prairie, and it would have been covered with snow. He wouldn't have been able to survive at all unless he had known how to be living in the forest. So over those next 6 months, until it snowed heavily, he did that. And then he actually got a weapon and joined the partisans. But I remember one of the stories he told me was that when he was out, they were hungry, they were looking for food, and he saw a rabbit. And he followed the rabbit. I think he had a knife. He really was hungry. He wanted to get this rabbit. And as he was going to jump on the rabbit, a wolf came out and jumped on the rabbit first and bit the rabbit's head and killed it and was fighting with it. And my father realized that the wolf was actually quite skinny and was desperate, because normally the wolf would know that a person was there and they would never go close to a person because they were afraid. But this wolf was not afraid because it also was desperate. There was all these people in the forests kind of hunting for the same small animals and birds and other food that the wolves would normally be just eating. So he was so desperate that he jumped on the wolf, and he fought a wolf with his bare hands and a knife, and he took out his knife and he killed the wolf just to get a little rabbit. I mean, it's amazing how desperate people were, but that's the kind of thing he had to do. And I remember years later when we used to go to Lake of the Woods for vacations, he would know exactly what berries and what roots we could eat, and we would make birch bark baskets with twigs and birch bark and other things, and we could make blankets. He was an expert because he spent almost 3 years in the forest.
Amazing. And then they're still in the forest, and Rubin catches typhus, a deadly disease. And Chassia refuses to leave his side. And tell us a little bit about that incredible story.
So it was already late 1943, or potentially early 44, and they had been with the partisans for quite a while. And typhus was a disease that was going around. It was killing a lot of people in Europe at that time. And my father got typhus, and he went into a coma. And the partisans, they decided that they had to leave where they were. And my father and his sister Chassia were both part of that group. And the group said, look, we have to leave here. It's too dangerous. We have to go on. And by that time, they were getting some food help from and some directions and instructions that were sort of parachuted to them by the Russians, who were starting to create this big backlash against the Nazis. So the partisans said, we have to go, and said, Chasya, you got to leave Rubin here. He's not going to wake up. I mean, we don't have any medicine. There's nothing we can do for him. Just leave him and come with us, otherwise you'll die too. And she said, no, I'm not leaving my brother. And she said, help me put him in a place that we can hide him. And they did. And they left a little bit of food. And he was in a coma, and she held on to him, and the partisans left. And they told him what direction they're going, just in case you have to leave him later on today or tomorrow. You'll go in this direction. And she stayed with him, and then she said, and she left him. She hid him. She hid my father, and she left him. And she came back many hours later with a liter of pure alcohol. And she put his head in her lap, and she force-fed him alcohol and whatever food she had. And he's still in a coma, and she's force-feeding him alcohol and whatever food she had. And 3 days it took she was doing this. Didn't leave his side. And after 3 days, his fever broke, and he woke up. And a week later, they were able to travel, and it took them 2 weeks, and they caught up with their partisans. But she saved his life.
It's a miraculous story. One of many. I mean, it is such a wonderful book. I want to ensure that we will have some time for questions, so I'm going to jump now to the end of the war. So, like my father, your father came to Canada as part of the Taylor's Project. So tell us a little bit about his connection to the Taylor's Project and how he ended up here.
So after the war, Chasya and Rubin were together, and they went to look for Harry, their brother Harry. And again, Chasya left the Bergen-Belsen. They were in a displaced persons camp called Bergen-Belsen, which had been in a concentration camp. And Chasya left, and she came back a couple weeks later with Harry. So the three were together. And at Bergen-Belsen, they wanted to teach. It was in the British part, so it was run by the British, and they were teaching different trades to the people who were there. And Harry became a tailor, and my father took the course to be a dental mechanic. So, unbeknownst to anybody in those places, in Bergen-Belsen, people in Canada were the manufacturers of clothing in Montreal and Toronto and Winnipeg and other places were trying to figure out how to get Jews, these displaced persons, into the country, because I'm sure most of you know the book None is Too Many by Irving Abella, and the government was really not prepared to let Jewish refugees into the country after the Second World War. But these manufacturers, clothing manufacturers, said, we need people, we need tailors. Otherwise, we need people, and if they speak Yiddish, it's even more important. So they actually got an agreement from the government to allow 2,000 tailors to come in. But as soon as the government learned that they were going to be Jewish, they said no. None. But the tailors were, and by the way, many non-Jewish manufacturers signed on to take 20 or 30 or 50 tailors who were Jewish to come back. They negotiated, and they had an alliance with the non-Jewish manufacturers, and they got the government to go all the way up, negotiated like Abraham did, from 100 and to 200 to 500 to 1,000. So they said, okay, in the end, that's as far as we're going to go. 1,000 can be Jewish, 1,000 non-Jewish. And they said, okay. So the word got around in Bergen-Belsen that if you're a tailor, you can apply to go to Canada. And this was already the end of 1947. My father and his sister and Harry had been in a displaced persons camp from the end of 1944 all the way to close to the end of 1947. And so more than 3 years in displaced. It was not, it wasn't a terrible place to be, but it wasn't where you couldn't start your life there. So they really wanted to go, and they were offered to go to Israel, but they decided they didn't want to get into another war, as they could see another war coming there, and they had had enough of it. So, but how Harry could go, because he was a tailor. But my father, they didn't ask for dental mechanics. There was no dental mechanic requirement. So I give Lawrence's father, Harry, unbelievable credit here because, and you can see that Herzl Pinsky's suitcase that he took from Europe, which has instructions about being a tailor. It has documents in it. It has patterns in it. And thank you, Lawrence, for bringing that today. He came up with an incredible scheme. He went down and did all the tailoring tests, the sewing and the physical, and he passed with flying colors for everything except the medical, and I'll tell you that in a second, because he was a very good tailor, and he was, physically fit and all that. But when the doctor, who had been sent from Canada, administered an eye test to Harry, Harry looked at it and he pretended he couldn't see very well. He couldn't see well enough to read the eye chart. And he's squinting, and the doctor says, "You can't read it?" He says, "No, I can't read it, but I can. I just give me a minute." But he, of course, he didn't. He just making the doctor mad. And then he said, "Look, I'll pass you. You're good, physical shape is fantastic. Other than that, other than your eyes, but you got to get glasses, and then I'll pass you." And he said, "No, I can't afford glasses. No way I can afford glasses. I'm not going to get glasses." And the doctor said, "Look, I can't let you come in. I can't give you a pass on the ship unless you get glasses." And Harry starts arguing with him. "Look, I'm so good. I'm a great tailor. You saw me get tailored." And the doctor's getting madder and madder, and finally says, "Look, that's enough. If you don't get glasses, I'm not letting you on the ship. I'm not passing you." He says, Okay, doctor, I promise I'm going to get glasses. I'm going to get them right away. When I come down to the ship, you'll see me with glasses, I promise." And the doctor says, "Okay, I'm putting a condition on that." So he goes away. He gives his papers to my father, Rubin. On the day that the ship is leaving, my father gets on the boat, and he's waiting. And at the end of the day, everyone's on the boat that's supposed to go, and Harry comes down to the front and says, "My papers were burned. They were burned. They're gone, all gone." And the guy said, "Look, you're just a guy. We're not letting you on this boat. Yes, we're Canadian, but we're not letting you on the boat." He says, "No, but I'm a tailor, and I really passed all the tests seriously." And they said, "No, not a chance." Harry starts jumping up and down and screaming, and he takes out the glasses from his pocket that he had bought, which were clear glass. And he starts screaming, "The doctor will remember me!" He starts screaming, and there's all shouting people in the boat, it's on the dock right beside the boat, and then everyone starts coming outside and look, what's this big fuss that everyone's making? And he says, the doctor. And finally, somebody calls out the doctor. The doctor's looking at out the balcony of the ship, and Harry's screaming, "Look, doctor, I got my glasses. Do you remember me?" Let him on. So it was amazing. They came together.
What a wonderful story. Now, did your father take part in the Spielberg interviews of the Shoah Foundation?
He didn't, but he took part in the Vancouver Holocaust Education Society's testimonies, and he testified in 1981 or 82, and a lot of his story, which wasn't gentle enough to tell children, as my father told us his bedtime stories, I learned from that testimony, and there's 2 hours of it. And interestingly enough, in the last year, I was notified that somebody, I think it's at Cornell University, actually used it for his PhD on his own study of the Holocaust, because my father testified about the fact that he was a partisan and what he did, and he was asked, did you take satisfaction in knowing you're killing people who killed your neighbors and your family? And he said, no. It gave me no satisfaction to kill them. I did what I had to do. And he was, most people said something different, and he kind of thought that this was worthy of following up, and I think it's online now in somebody's work, a PhD of his studies of the Holocaust.
So before we go to some questions, the other wonderful part of your book, of course, is the Roots trip that you alluded to early on. What else would you like to tell us about that?
Right. So I mentioned the name Jana. She was a history teacher at the high school of Jatlovo, a town of about 10,000 people. And what excited me so much is she didn't know anything about the Jews. She was born there, perhaps, and she saw that every year there is a parade. Everybody in town goes and fixes up and cleans the cemetery of the town and puts flowers and wreaths on the graves, and they make it beautiful. Once a year, there's a special day that's happening. But she noticed that there's one cemetery, which seemed to be the biggest cemetery when she looked at it, that no one ever went to, and no one ever cleaned up, and no one put wreaths of flowers on it. And she wanted to know what's going on. Why is that the case? So she learned that there had been Jews who had lived in the town. And because she was a history teacher, she dug into it, and she started learning about it, and that brought her to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And in fact, what was really amazingly touching for me was when I came, based partly on my manuscript, in the high school there was a little room, not very big, kind of like a big closet, which was a museum dedicated to the Jewish community, where no Jewish community existed anymore. So the high school had a sort of a smallish room. On one side was depicted the life of the Jews in the town before the Holocaust, and at the end there was a sort of a dark picture of dark clouds and lightning and thunder, and depicting the difficult time of the Holocaust. And on the right side was pictures and depiction of some of the Zettlers who had survived and had gone other places. And there was a beautiful picture of my father's family, and they had gotten it from us because my brother had been there, and they could talk about this Pinsky family and others who had come to Canada and made a new life for themselves, and how they were surviving and they chose life in a new place. It was very, very touching and very moving, and I kept a blog while I was there, and you kind of go in the ups and downs, and I learned that she wasn't the only one. There are other people in Belarus who had devoted themselves to creating memorials for the Jewish people who had been murdered in the Holocaust at no benefit to themselves. And I said, why are you doing this? And I talked to a couple of them, and they said they're Russian Orthodox Catholics. And they said, it's because my faith makes me do it, because it's the right thing to do, and we believe that everyone deserves the dignity of being remembered. So I call them saints. They're truly amazing people, and it was unbelievably uplifting to meet them, several of them, when we were in Belarus. So I finished off the part of the manuscript that the rest of my father's life I had it edited. I included the Roots trip, and then I included some information about the Taylor Project, which I really didn't know anything about until my wife Daniela saw in the Jewish Independent weekly newspaper in Vancouver, a little ad that said, if you were involved as a tailor coming to Canada after the war, please contact this number. And I did, and I had no idea, and it turned into an amazing way for me to loop the circle, to finish the circle, because I learned a lot about it, and I got some of the documents which are now copied in the book. You'll see I received from the Taylor Project. They had the manifesto of the passengers from the General Sturgis ship, and they had the Taylor's Project list of who was working where, which tailors were working where. And by then my father was learning to be a teacher. He never did become a tailor. He learned to become a teacher, which is what brought him to Winnipeg. He went through Jewish seminary in Montreal. One of his teachers was Irving Layton, the poet laureate of Canada. And when he finished, I mean, he was very learned already, having been in yeshiva most of his life until the Holocaust. He came to, he saw there was an ad for somebody to teach Yiddish in Parrott Shul in Winnipeg. He had no idea what Winnipeg was. He thought it was like Europe, they said you can buy a train ticket. He thought it was going to be 2 hours. It was 2.5 days from Montreal. But he got here and he made a life for himself. He made a good life for himself, and he stayed here until 1970. So he was very happy here. And and Winnipeg is part of our hearts.
Well, thank you. And I know that when they were doing the research on the Taylor's Project, because they published a book, the Jewish Heritage Center was very much involved because we had a lot of information in our archive as well. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, I know that people may have questions. Adina, I'm not sure where you are, can't see you in the light. Adina Lungan from JCFS will have a traveling mic, and if you can just raise your hand if you have a question to ask Bernard. If there are any.
Give me time to get there.
They haven't read the book yet. How can they ask questions,
Well,
right?
You are in for such a treat. We're so grateful to Bernard for his generosity in providing a copy of the book for you. When we're done here, you will really enjoy this. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story.
Just before you ask, I just want to say about the book. I'm not in it for the money, as you can tell from me giving it away, but I can't do this all over the place. So it's on Amazon. I talked to Amazon and said, look, what do you need in order to do a print every time somebody orders it? And they said, we need $6.91 US. I said, okay, round it up to $6.99. I get 7 cents, all right? And you just do that because you can order it for $9.44 Canadian. They haven't changed it since the dollar went down. And if you like the book, please go to Amazon and rate it. They have a star rating, and you can actually put a review in, and Goodreads as well. And the reason, not for me to make money, but I just want to get the story out. I want people to know I want to say that every Holocaust survivor has an incredibly unique story which only allowed them to survive because of incredible luck or perseverance or determination or the kindness of others or a combination of all of the above, because more than 2/3 of the Jews of Europe were all killed. So everybody who survived, it was a relentless attempt to murder every single one of them, and they have incredible stories that everyone should be remembered. So that's why I wrote this story.
Here I am, Belle. I appreciate what you have told us today, and it's very similar to me. It sounds almost like my own story. I have 3 sons who are the sons of 2 Holocaust survivors. It was something that Belle just mentioned at the beginning, and that was that the Jews in Germany during Kristallnacht were then penalized for the Germans breaking the glass and destroying the synagogues, and then they had to pay a penalty of cleaning up. I was 6 in 1941. I was for 3 years under German occupation. I was for 6 years in displaced persons camps. I was also one of the fortunate ones who had typhus, so everything sounds very familiar. My question to you is this. You are very similar to my own sons. You are the second generation. I know what I've shared with them. I know their reaction, and I know the impact that it has made on them, which I'm quite certain has made on you from your parents. I would like to know how you feel today about what is happening. In 1938, I view not only as an event, as a pogrom, because we are accustomed to pogroms, but I view it as the beginning of the end of the Jewish people, not because of the happening, but of the silence of the world who didn't care of what was happening. Everyone was silent, no one cared, and no one interfered. You are living today, after October 7th of 2023. How do you feel today as a Holocaust survivor's son, knowing that Holocaust survivors are literally reliving the past and not believing that they would survive long enough to experience the apathy and the blame that the whole world seems to be blaming the Jews, and the total disinterest in justice for Jewish people? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I was privileged yesterday to go to the Sharet Tzedek and hear Rabbi Wolpe speak, and he made it clear, and I have my own answer to this, but I'm going to give you his answer too. It seems like we have nothing but enemies out there, but it's not true. We have friends. They need to learn to speak up better, but we do have friends. But from before that, I have an answer that I came up with on my own because I feel it. Several things. Number one, there's huge differences between what happened in the 30s and what happens today. In the 30s, the government were against the Jews. The government is not doing enough to protect the Jews, but the governments here and in Western Europe do not want to exterminate Jews. It's not a government project. It is a project of others, perhaps, in certain countries where the Jews aren't, but it's not in Canada for sure. It's not in the United States. It's not Western Canada, Western Europe. The other thing is the difference, the huge difference, the biggest difference between the 1930s and 2004 is Israel. We have a country that protects Jews. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's difficult. They have an army. They're going to win. I have no doubt about it. They're going to win this war. And they're going to take precautions which are going to protect the Jews in Israel and thereby protect the Jews around the world. I don't think it's the same. And I'll say one other thing. People ask me when I speak sometimes, what would my father think about what's going on today? And I say, he would have hope. Think of yourself and think of others who actually survived in the end of 1942. I don't think anyone could have imagined having a normal life again. You're a Jew, you're on the run, you're in the forest, you're under Nazi occupation, everyone around you is dying. You don't know how you're going to survive to the end of today, never mind tomorrow and the next day. How are you going to have a family? How are you going to make a community? It happened. It happened. The Nazis, the villains were defeated. Germany was denazified. All those countries I mean, there's a Jewish community in Germany right now. There's Jews in Belarus, and Jews are being respected in Belarus and Poland and other places, which nobody ever thought. So I would say it's a difficult time now. It's the worst time since the Holocaust, but it's not the same. It's not close to the same. And my father would have said, you got to keep hope, because that's what keeps you going, and then tomorrow will be better.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for sharing that wonderful story about how your father and uncle came to Canada. You mentioned that your aunt, their sister, was with them at the time. Can you tell us what happened to your aunt at that time?
Sure. She didn't come. She stayed in Bergen-Belsen and got married there, and they came to Montreal, I think in 1951 or 50, and they stayed there for a while. And then my aunt Hasia was divorced from her husband. She never admitted she was divorced, but he divorced her. And Melvin Fenson acted for her, and he was a family lawyer, which goes with tradition in the family, I guess. Not me. I'm too scared. So she actually, when I was born in 1954, she said, "I'm coming to help you, Jenny, my mother, with your new baby." So she came and she lived with our family, and from 1954 on, basically she lived close to our family. So she lived here in Winnipeg from 1954 until the early 1970s, and she worked at Noah Whitman's bookstore for years, and she was here and she was close to my family, but my father moved to Regina with our family in 1970. He bought a Skid Row hotel, and that's the Jewish trade, I guess, and he was there until it burned down in 1976, and in 1977 he moved to Vancouver. And so but each time, Hasia was very close to our family, and Hasia had, I would say she was affected by the Holocaust much more than the other people of our family, my Uncle Harry and my father. And, she wasn't that stable mentally, but she was proud and fierce, and she had done things in the Holocaust which really were incredible. And so my father felt very close to her, and every time he moved, if things weren't going well for her, he would fly. When he moved to Regina a year later, he flew to Regina, flew back to Winnipeg, packed her up, brought her to Regina, gave her a job. When he moved to Vancouver, a little while later, he flew to Regina, packed her up, moved her to Vancouver. So she was near our family for the rest of her life, and she passed away in 2000. She was the same throughout her life. She was fierce and proud and quite a force to deal with. My kids at age 6 or 7 saying, "Why are you getting Aunt Hasia to babysit us? We're babysitting her. She's smaller than us." And she's scared. She's afraid to open the door. She's afraid if somebody knocks on the door. But that was her. She had some problems. She was not well adjusted to it, but she was close to our family for the rest of her life, and that's all she had. She didn't have children of her own. Thank you for that question.
And thank you for that, because on Thursday night at the Kristallnacht program, we saw a film about the resistance of many of the Jewish people, and it's wonderful to hear the stories of the strength of the Jewish women who provided so much, who resisted so incredibly. And so the story of your aunt is quite amazing. Thank you.
Mr. Pinsky, I forget, your first name is Bernard, right?
Bernard, yeah.
Okay, I have two quick questions. One is, do people know that over 1 million Jews fought in the Second World War in the armies of their countries, as well as the Jewish Brigade, 5,000, and the British, 30,000 partisans in Europe? I mean, the Jews were not all passive victims. I had 3 uncles in the services, 2 in the Air Force, 1 in the Army. And also, how do you react to if German criticism of Israel defending itself? I don't know if it's that widespread in Germany, but how do you feel about it when Germans act self-righteous and embargo Israel or whatever?
So I'll answer the first question first. I had no idea, so I can't speak for anybody else. I had no idea there was 1 million Jews fighting in armed services, etc. I do know that in the First World War, that 20% of the officers of the Austrian army, of the Austrian Empire's army, were Jewish. So within a very, very, very short time, you had people who were officers and were honored by the Austrian emperor and were considered to be the most dedicated citizens of Austria and Germany, were vilified and and terrorized and became the victims of a genocide within about 20 years. It's unbelievable how fast it happened. And so I didn't know about that, but I do know there were lots of, I mean, the Jews definitely fought. And it's, you know, the Jews, as I think some article I was reading the last few days talked about the fact that, you know, Jews were generally a very passive people for 2,000 years, and look where it got them. And so people wonder why Israel has a very strong army. The alternative didn't work for 2,000 years. You got to be, at some point, you got to figure out that it's not working, and you got to protect yourself from. And your second question was
about if sometimes there are German people who do criticize Israel. You're too aggressive. You're this.
You know, I think Germany's done a very good job of denazifying and teaching the Holocaust and making sure that there's memorials. But you're never going to convince everybody. Look, there's Jews who seriously criticize Jews defending themselves in Israel and anywhere else. So, you know, look, I'm not trying to be political here, but there are people who believe one ideology or another, and they are entitled to their opinions. But I'm hoping that Jews today will generally, in great majorities, understand that we have to band together as a community in Canada, and I'm trying to make sure that that happens through the work of our foundation, to make sure that people understand that we all have to protect each other. We have to look for each other. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zabazeh. We have to worry about each other and have to do things together and not reinvent the wheel, and take best practices and bring them across to wherever Jews live.
I would just like to echo what Bernard said. No one in Europe is doing the job that Germany is doing as far as teaching about the Holocaust, teaching about anti-Semitism, and I only wish that we had laws as stringent as Germany does, as far as Holocaust denial, as far as anti-Semitism, etc. And we've got a lot to learn here.
Well, first of all, thank you for giving us a glimpse into your family history. And I would also like to thank you for, did you have a handwritten note in every single book?
I
keep up
came
hope
here at 12:30. Always keep hope,
I mean,
and I signed it, and I did sign 120 of them
But
today,
that's not-
so that everyone would
Yes.
remember that hope is a really important. Jewish people cannot survive without hope. You've got to have hope. So that is the story. No matter what happened to my dad, he always had hope, even when he didn't know it.
Well, thank you for making the effort, but this is not my point that I'm trying to make, you know. I'm very grateful, and what you just mentioned, I want to support it, that you pointed out that after World War I, the Jewish population, by the way, I speak as a Goy, the Jewish population was respected in many parts of Europe at a time of emancipation. To give a little bit of historical background, that there was a turning away from all the persecution, and the Jewish population was accepted, embraced, not under those strict regimens that go back to medieval times with ghetto and all that thing, but that they could choose their jobs and everything and become respected people in the community, so that when this little person, from Austria came around spewing all his hate, that this was a slap in the face, thinking, we did our service to our country, we were in the military, we served, we did our due diligence, and we were behind it. And so why is all that blame against us? Why is all this hate here all of a sudden coming our way? And something that I can't answer, I can't understand. I know that my own family was a part of it. My grandfather, my opa, was a party member. He did not participate, this is the family saga, he did not participate in Kristallnacht, but he cycled around and was devastated by the destruction that he saw. However, he did not stand up to help. Unlike, what it says, for example, in Proverbs, that, to seek justice for the poor and for the needy. Though none of that was, extended and given to those who were victims of something that was devastating and outrageous. Nobody stood up. The people just stood there idly. I mean, you are talking about the background from, Poland, and I think Kristallnacht did not happen in Poland as it happened, for example, in Germany or Austria. But there were certainly then consequences once the war started and concentration camps were erected and all the fate that came along with it. So yes, what you're saying, keeping up the hope is a wonderful thing. And if you're looking at apocalyptic literature in scripture, this is a beautiful thing. It feels so dark, but when you look through it deeply, you see the notion of hope that shines through it. Just a comment.
Thank you. If you have any more questions for Bernard, I'm going to invite you to, we have a little reception back there with some coffee and cookies, and maybe ask him in person, and also get your copy of this wonderful book. I want to thank Jewish Home Family Service for partnering with us, and and just remind you that it is one book per family unit that is here. I want to thank Bernard and the Roadburg Foundation for their incredible generosity. And thank you to all of you for being here with us today.